Hello and welcome to this Chanel CPD session. My name is Jonathan Moore. I'm a veterinary surgeon and the Veterinary Technical Services Manager for Chanel Pharma. Today I shall be talking about parasite control in the spring for both cattle and sheep production systems. This presentation is accredited by both AMTRA and VetPol. For information on claiming CPD points, please contact your Chanel representative. This presentation will cover three important subject areas: the importance of stock management and parasite control in the spring, responsible use of anti-parasitic products, and finally, the key spring parasites for both sheep and cattle. So what are the key parasitic risks that we see in the spring? Well, there are two critical types that we need to address: nematodes and coccidiosis. This applies to both calves and lambs, and in some cases older animals. We also have to consider fluke. Chronic fluke issues tend to occur more in animals that are at least 1 year of age or more due to the life cycle of the fluke parasite. We shall look at this more towards the end of the presentation. This slide nicely visualizes when key parasitic problems occur throughout the year. As we've said, the primary concerns for producers at this time of year, i.e. the spring, are coccidiosis and gutworms. Lungworm and acute fasciolosis tend to occur later in the year. These spring issues can be compounded by adverse weather conditions, and in some cases, specific weather events are required to activate parasites. For example, nematodes can be seen earlier if warm weather arrives sooner in the year. It should be noted that climate change is altering our traditional weather patterns, and we are now seeing parasitic problems occurring outside of their expected seasonal periods. And this is something that we will have to increasingly consider in the future. Experts now suggest that in many cases, especially for nematode infections, we need to move on from blanket treatments, preventative measures, and even active rotations. They recommend the following as the optimal approach to parasite control. The first of these is accurately monitoring the condition of the stock and the weight gain. Identifying key clinical signs, such as coughing for lungworm and scouring for parasitic gastroenteritis. These clinical signs give us a very good guide as to what parasitic challenges that the stock may be encountering. We need detailed knowledge of the farm history and also the stock history, what issues have been seen in the farm previously, what times of year if they occurred, etc., the types of parasites, the level of challenge, for example. We need to adequately quarantine new stock coming onto a premises and treat those appropriately. Prior to any treatments, testing should always be carried out. And that includes things like fecal worm egg counts, bulk milk, ELISA tests, blood tests, etc. Based on the results of that testing, obviously we select the appropriate product to deal with the problem that we have on hand. But after treatment, it's important to retest and to monitor the treatment success, and also to identify any potential resistance issues. It's also suggested to use older classes of anthelmintics before newer classes, where appropriate and where susceptibility to these particular actives is known to be present in that particular parasite type. So, for example, nematodes is often susceptible to benzimidazoles, the 1BZ products, and these should be selected prior to choosing something from the newer classes of parasiticides. For nematodes and trematodes, as we've said, blanket treatments and simple rotation of actives is no longer best practice. Moving to this optimal approach will help minimize the development of parasite resistance to actives and prolong the lifespan and usefulness of those actives available to us today. This is the currently recommended principle of parasite control for the majority of parasitic problems encountered on farms. Start by testing to see what issues you're actually dealing with, what type of parasites are involved. Then treat with an appropriate anthelmintic. After treatment and after the specified period of time, retesting should be undertaken. This checks for the efficacy of the treatment given and also helps to identify any resistance issues. If there are problems with efficacy, then treatment may need to be adjusted and another active given, and then the cycle begins again. On the subject of resistance, it's worth mentioning the following. Resistance is considered to be present in a population of parasites when antiparasitic treatment results in a less than 95% decrease in parasite numbers. Successful treatment removes more than 95% of parasites from the animal, and this is determined, as we say, by testing such as fecal worm egg counts. Now we have the why, the big question that people often have. Why do we need to do all this and follow this particular approach? What are the benefits? It's really crucial to be mindful of this, especially when considering return on investment. Managing and treating animals for parasite infections costs time and money, so we need to be clear on the rationale for undertaking control strategies and be choosing the most favourable approaches to maximise that return on investment. First of all, obviously, we need to minimise the occurrence of clinical disease, but also subclinical disease as well. By treating appropriately, we improve the welfare of the animals, and this has a dramatic positive impact on the perception of farming for the general public. Dealing with clinical and subclinical infections helps to optimize growth rates and improve feed conversion ratios. We reduce pasture contamination. This is obviously important for stock that are grazing the pasture currently, but also stock that will graze those pastures in the future. By using appropriate treatment, we will increase farm profits, and that's based on that simple return on investment formula. We will also reduce the selection pressure driving parasite resistance, and we will extend the lifespan of the products that we have available to us today. Resistance is becoming an increasing problem for many of the actives we are familiar with. When an active is first brought to market, resistance in the parasite population is low, and the product tends to work very well. Unfortunately, this effectiveness can be hampered by indiscriminate and/or inappropriate use, which creates a selection pressure in the parasite population. Before too long, we start to see the effectiveness of the product start to decrease. There are numerous research papers which have looked into the problem, and here's the results from a recent study in Ireland. In this study looked at 18 sheep farms across Ireland and examined the resistance to certain parasites to commonly used wormers on these sheep farms. And in this study, it was found that 100% of the parasites examined were resistant to the benzimidazoles, the white class. 17% were resistant to the yellow class, that's levamisole, and 16% of the parasites were resistant to the clear class, that's your ivermectins, moxidectins, etc. So, a concerning result. Another Irish study looked into this issue for cattle farms, and again, the results are concerning. This study looked at 16 farms, again across Ireland, and examined the resistance in the commonly used wormer groups. And here we see benzimidazoles showing a prevalence of resistance at around 60%. Levamisole here was less, 18%, but importantly, ivermectin, 100% resistance rate in this study. Moxidectin, again, very high at 73%. So significant concerns. And these findings are being found in other parts of Ireland and across the UK and Europe as well. We need to maintain the efficacy of the molecules available to us, and to this end, experts recommend the following approach. The 5 R's, the right approach. First, these is the right product for the right type of worm. Second, the right animal. Third, the right time. Fourth, the right dose rate. And 5, given in the right way. This advice comes from cows, but it's repeated by several other bodies, such as the Irish Agriculture and Food Development Authority, NARDIS, and SQPs. Remember, pasture rotation and management, as well as good husbandry, are also crucial. We need to keep detailed pasture records of stock usage and disease prevalence within the stock and across the pastures. We need to have very good general hygiene practices to prevent cross-contamination of different groups of animals, and also to prevent infections coming onto the farm from outside. Finally, appropriate stocking density recommendations should be followed. If stocking densities go above these, then disease pressure will be increased and the chance of encountering problems will be again increased. When selecting and using products, producers should always bear following in mind as well. Take note of the duration of action of the active that you're using. Also take careful note of the meat and milk withdrawal times, especially important in the dairy industry, as many of the products we will talk about cannot be used in milking cows. There are environmental considerations too. Many of the actives that we use can be harmful to aquatic life, for example, so all efforts should be taken to minimize contamination of waterways and general environmental contamination. Finally, always read the datasheet and/or product information leaflet and contact your vet or prescriber if you have any questions or concerns. Finally, before we get to the parasites, here are some important reminders of some of the practical and dosing considerations that farmers must bear in mind. These points may seem simple, but they are easily overlooked and can be a significant aspect of potential treatment failures. These all have to be ruled out before the possibility of parasitic resistance can be considered. So prior to any treatment, ensure that equipment is calibrated correctly and in good working order. Animals' body weights should be accurately established and the animals dosed accordingly. This will often involve grouping animals of a similar weight together and dosing for the heaviest animal in that group. Avoid underdosing. And as we said previously, follow label storage instructions and recommendations on product information leaflets, SPCs, etc. Right, we're going to move on to consider the actual parasites that we see in the spring now. Before we get there, just a quick but important note. This presentation covers the major parasitic risks for the time of year in question, but other problems may be encountered. Always reach out to your vet or prescriber if you need more help or advice. Let's go on to look at specific parasites and classes of parasite that affect sheep and cattle in the spring. We're going to begin by considering the nematode parasites, and we'll start by focusing on sheep, as sheep show the biggest potential impact from this type of parasitic disease. As you can see from this graph, nematodiris, sometimes known as the threadneck worm, is the most significant nematode problem in the spring. Teledorsagia may start to cause an issue in late spring, but it's primarily a worm of the summer. Let's look at nematodiris in more detail, as this nematode shows some unusual features when compared to other worms. The first interesting feature to note is that it has a 1-year life cycle. The larvae wait on the pasture and actually develop to their infective L3 stage within the egg. They are therefore very protected when they're in the environment. They emerge en masse from the eggs when the soil temperature increases to above 10 degrees centigrade after a prolonged period of cold. This often occurs just at the point that new lambs are turned out onto pasture at around 5 to 8 weeks of age. The worms cause damage to the small intestinal lining, leading to scouring, dehydration, and potentially death. The damage can often occur before new eggs are detectable in the lamb's feces. So this can sometimes make diagnosis difficult. Worm egg counts may be slightly less useful in this situation. It's worth noting that the risk period for lambs can often coincide with that for coccidiosis, and indeed the diseases are often seen at the same time. We will look at coccidiosis in more detail later in the presentation. The emergence of the worms from the eggs can be forecast based on weather patterns, and SQPs have a really useful forecasting tool in the UK, and I would recommend visiting the website for more information. Resistance to white wormers is rare, but there are signs that it may be increasing. The recommendation is still to use a white drench if lambs are grazing an at-risk pasture at high-risk times, i.e. one that has had lambs on it last year and at a time of mass emergence. Remember to retest 10 days after dosing to check for efficacy and resistance. Adult sheep are immune to this parasite after about 4 to 5 months at pasture. These are some key points to note for Nematodirus. This parasite can strike incredibly quickly and cause really devastating losses in a flock. Worm egg counts can be less useful because the damage is done by immature larvae before eggs are seen in the feces. If lambs are grazing pasture that has had lambs on it last spring, then they are at risk of this parasite. Full risk assessment and forecasts are essential to manage this condition. And this problem traditionally occurs from April to June, but can be seen earlier if warm weather occurs earlier in the year. What about treating Nematodirus? Well, as we've said before, it's primarily involving a white drench, a benzimidazole drench. So anthelmintic resistance to white wormers, the 1BZ class in Nematodirus batis, remains uncommon in the UK and Ireland. However, reduced efficacy has been reported in isolated cases. Treatment choice should always be guided by risk assessment and post-treatment testing, i.e. that worm egg count 10 days post-treatment. The actives that tend to be used are fenbendazole and albendazole, and Chanel has 2 products on the market with these actives, Zerafen and Albex. Oxfendazole may also be an option. Let's go on to consider the key spring nematode risks in cattle. Now, it's worth noting, especially for dairy cattle, that the UK production systems are often have a non-seasonal calving pattern. And this means that calves can be around at any time of the year, and we can have essentially seasonal calf diseases at any time of the year. For example, we may see coccidiosis in younger animals in the autumn, for example. This coincides as well with changing weather patterns, as we've mentioned previously. In Ireland, calving tends to be more seasonal, making disease predictions slightly simpler in cattle. Let's start by looking at ostatagia, and in particular ostatagia type 2 infection. What is ostatagia type 2? Well, this is when larvae are ingested in the autumn and then they go into stasis or hyperbiosis in the stomach wall. From February to May, they then emerge from the stomach wall and cause parasitic gastroenteritis. And here we see weight loss, we see reduced weight gain. In older milking animals, we see reduced milk yields and often diarrhea, especially in younger animals. Worst case scenario in calves, we may see death. The worm causes damage, and the clinical signs occur when the worms erupt out of the abomasal glands and damage that stomach lining as part of their life cycle. In calves, as I say, the worst case scenario is death in those that are severely infected. However, reduced growth rates and scouring are more commonly seen. Adult cattle usually have developed an acquired immunity by 18 months of age, but this immunity is described as non-sterile, and this means that infections can still occur, especially if disease pressures are high. In adult animals, abomasal damage leads to reduced appetite, reduced acid production, and decreased feed intake. This is particularly important in the dairy industry where milk yields can be negatively impacted. The cow's immune systems are working hard to deal with the problem, and yet the feed input is reduced. Scour can also be present in adult animals, and these adult animals can lose 20% of their body weight in just 7 to 10 days in worst case scenarios, along with that reduced milk yield. L3 stages of ostatagia can also overwinter in soil or on pasture and provide infection pressures in the following year if cattle are grazed on the same pasture. Bulk milk tank ELISA tests are often useful for identifying the problem in milking herds. Next, we have Cuperia. This nematode is considered to be relatively mild in comparison to ostatagia, but can have significant impact on production and cause parasitic gastroenteritis. The problem is most prevalent in calves as their acquired immunity is yet to develop. Animals develop acquired immunity after their first grazing season, and as a rule of thumb, cattle must be at grass for at least 8 months on pasture that has been used for cattle in the previous year to get enough exposure for immunity to develop. Like Osteotargia, L3 life stages can overwinter in the soil or on pasture. There are significant production impacts from both Osteotargia and Cuperia, and these can result in a 30% reduction in growth rates and a loss of up to 1 kilogram of milk yield per day in adult milking dairy cows. How can producers deal with these spring roundworm issues? Well, there's a number of things to consider here. The first is grazing strategies. So pastures that have not been grazed in the previous year are considered clean, which is good in terms of the worm challenge, but they don't, however, allow that development of acquired immunity. Housing treatments in the late autumn, early winter can also reduce disease pressures over winter and into the spring period. And in terms of anthelmintic use, there are a number of different things to consider here. Many people will choose early season strategic treatments, and this is treatment given when cattle are turned out onto pasture which has been grazed by cattle the previous year or within 3 weeks of turnout. This reduces pasture contamination but may increase resistant selection pressure, and this is compounded if animals are moved to fresh pasture after treatment. Bolus, clear class injectable products are often used for this approach. People can also choose targeted treatments, and this is based on production data and test results. And as we've said previously, this may help to reduce resistant selection pressure. Finally, there is treatments in the face of clinical disease, the so-called therapeutic treatments. Farmers should speak to their vet or prescriber for further advice on which approach is best for their particular situation. So in terms of products available to treat Osteotargia type 2, we have a number of different actives here. Fenbendazole, aprinomectin, which is largely used in the dairy industry due to its zero milk withdrawal, oxfendazole, ivermectin, levamisole, albendazole, moxidectin, and doramectin. And as you can see here, Chanel has a number of products which cover these actives. And although licensed, levamisole is less effective against Osteotargia. The benzimidazoles generally show less resistance compared to the situation in sheep. However, often the 3 ml products are the best choice. And as we say, aprinomectin for milking cows with its 0 milk day withdrawal is very good, although reports of resistance have arisen in recent years. An appropriate treatment at winter housing can also help to reduce the severity of disease impact in the spring. For Cuperia, the list of actives that we can use to treat it are very similar: fenbendazole, oxfendazole, levamisole, albendazole, ivermectin, moxidectin, and doramectin. And as previously, Chanel has a number of products that contain these actives. Note there's no Epramec here, as the problem tends to occur in younger animals, not in milk. There are resistance issues, especially with ivermectin in Ireland, as we've seen in that study previously. And there are also signs that can be cross-resistance with moxidectin. Benzimidazoles and levamisole tend to still be effective with lower incidence of resistance reported. Chanel also now has 2 injectable 3 ml options for early season strategic treatment. The first of these is Moxidex LA, which contains 100 mg per ml moxidectin solution for injection, and this product is just for cattle. Moxidex LA provides up to 120 days protection against lungworm and Osteotargia, and it's also licensed to treat Cuperia. Note the meat and offal withdrawal, 108 days, and this product is not permitted for use in animals producing milk for human consumption. Chanel also has Doramax. This is a 10 mg per ml doramectin solution for injection for cattle and sheep this time. This one provides protection of up to 35 days for Osteotargia and lungworm and up to 21 days of protection for Cuperia. Because of that slightly reduced protection time, we also have reduced meat and offal withdrawal at 70 days. Again, similar to Moxdex LA, this product is not permitted for use in animals producing milk for human consumption. Duramax can also be used a second time later in the year, whereas Moxdex LA injection should only be used once in a year at turnout. Okay, so we have now covered the major nematode species in both cattle and sheep. Let's move on to consider coccidiosis in lambs and calves. This is an important concern in the spring and can lead to both clinical and subclinical impacts on young stock. It's worth noting that we actually do have a detailed CPD presentation on coccidiosis, but this section covers the key points. By all means, review that coccidiosis presentation if you want more information. Okay, so what is coccidiosis? Well, it's a disease caused by a single-celled organism called Eimeria, which is a protozoal parasite. It should be noted that protozoal parasites like Eimeria behave differently to many of the nematode parasites we have previously considered, and this is the reason, as we shall see, for employing differing control strategies when managing this parasite. Coccidiosis causes breakdown of the intestinal lining, preventing absorption of nutrients and water. The coccidia oocysts, which are essentially the eggs, are plentiful in the animal's environment. These oocysts essentially are everywhere and are very difficult to eradicate. They are also very resilient and can survive for well over a year on pastures or in housing environments. The parasite multiplies very quickly in the hosts, meaning that many oocysts shed into the environment. Every single ruminant in a commercial setting will experience coccidia. The question is, what level of severity will that exposure be? In addition, oocysts can travel on dirty boots, hands, buckets, and even birds' feet. There are many different subtypes of Eimeria, and these are host species specific. Different species of animals have their own subtypes, including birds. Cow subspecies can't affect sheep and vice versa. And even goat subtypes cannot affect sheep. It is a myth that bird coccidiosis can infect other animals. However, as we've said before, birds can transport oocysts from place to place, increasing the likelihood of spreading. Oocysts lie dormant until they encounter moisture and warmth over 12 degrees Celsius. Once this happens, the oocysts can sporulate and become infective. Oocysts can be killed by certain types of disinfectant, always check the label, and extreme heat. But even if these are undertaken, oocysts tend to be very hard to eradicate, and as such, the parasite can be considered to be ubiquitous in the environment. It will be there. The final point is extremely important. Young animals are at great risk before they develop acquired immunity to the parasite. We want to limit exposure, but not completely prevent it. We want exposure to happen in a controlled way early in life in order for acquired immunity to develop, but we don't want young animals to become clinically impacted and overwhelmed. What are the clinical symptoms of coccidiosis? I'm sure you can name a few. Let's go through the list. The first is a black or bloody scour, and this bloody scour is due to the breakdown of the intestinal lining. Animals often show tail swishing due to discomfort. They are often straining to pass feces. They have fluid loss because of that diarrhea. They also have anemia because of that intestinal lining breakdown. They're often lethargic. They often have a lack of appetite. They may have a concurrent fever because there may be concurrent infection causing that fever. And finally, worst case scenario, animals may die. This is more commonly seen in sheep. This slide contains a highly important concept, and I think it's one of the most important messages regarding coccidiosis. Cases of clinical coccidiosis with the symptoms we've just looked at represent only 4% of infections. 96% of infections are subclinical and don't show any clinical signs. Animals with subclinical coccidiosis will not perform as well, and growth rates, food conversion rates, and times to reach key milestones will all be impacted. Having spoken to many farmers about this issue, it seems like this point is not widely understood. Coccidiosis is both an economic and clinical disease. However, many people only think about the clinical signs that they see, and this is understandable. It's what's visible when we look at an animal. People might look at a flock or a group of calves, and they look perfectly healthy and not think there is an issue with coccidiosis there. But under the surface, it's causing problems. So people might not consider that a seemingly healthy animal is being affected by cocci and missing out on optimizing the animal's health and performance. When will animals be exposed to coccidiosis, and when are we likely to see challenges relating to this condition? Well, one thing that's worth bearing in mind before we get onto that is that coccidia have a pre-patent period of 21 days. This is essentially the life cycle within the animal. So it's the time from when the sporulated oocyst is ingested to the time that new oocysts are produced at the back end of the animal. And for cocci, in general, the pre-patent period is around 21 days. This is an important number to bear in mind when it comes to exposure times and treatment times. So for calves, exposure tends to occur between around 4 to 17 weeks of age, and it's particularly common to see issues a week or two after moving animals to a new environment. Lambs, the window is a little shorter, and exposure tends to happen around 4 to 7 weeks of age. And this coincides with when the ewe-derived immunity wanes around about 3 weeks of age. Note as well, if we think back to nematodirus, this is where it coincides with potential nematodirus problems, and we get essentially a double whammy for these lambs. There are several actives available to combat coccidiosis, and diclazerol is a key one. Chanel's diclazerol is called dicoxin. Let's now have a closer look at the product specifics for dicoxin. So, active diclazerol, 0.25%. And what this does is essentially break the life cycle of the parasite within animals. It has a short half-life, so it breaks the life cycle of that generation of parasites in the host animal, but then the immune system of the animal can still see subsequent generations of cocci coming through. So it provides protection during those key risk periods, but still allows the development of acquired immunity. This product can be used in both calves and lambs at the same dose rate. And we have 1 litre, 2.5 litre and 5 litre pack sizes available. And note as well the 0-day meat withdrawal. The final point here is really important. No resistance to diclazerol has currently been reported. And this lack of resistance is really important and is part of the reason why we can be comfortable with the preventative treatment measures that we employ when managing this condition. Let's think about this more now. So, what about treatment timings? Well, this all depends on when exposure occurs, obviously, the management approach taken with animals, and also the severity of exposure. And broadly speaking, there are 3 options. The first here is the prophylactic approach. Essentially, this is where a farm's history is known in detail, and coccidiosis problems tend to occur at very specific times of the year on, year out. And actually, this situation doesn't happen that much anymore because weather patterns are shifting and changing so much. The cocci challenge tends to occur at different times of year. But if a farm does have this and it always experiences coccidiosis at a certain week of the year, for example, then treatment can be given to a group 7 days in advance of expected symptoms. The second approach here is probably the most commonly employed, and that is the metaphylactic approach. And this is treating animals at specific times based on the expected risk periods that we've talked about. So for calves, treatment is given 14 days after the animal has entered a risk environment. And for lambs, treatment is given at 4 to 6 weeks of age. Finally, people could employ a therapeutic approach, i.e. wait and see clinical signs and then treat accordingly. But remember, damage has already been done at that point, and also you have all the subclinical impact of the other 96% of animals that will have subclinical cocci. So, as I say, in general, metaphylaxis is the preferred approach. This situation differs from the situation when we consider nematodes, where resistance to certain classes of product is becoming an increasing problem. So in these situations, prophylactic and metaphylactic use is discouraged to help slow the development of resistance. In these circumstances, as we've talked about, it's recommended that testing be carried out to demonstrate a need for treatment. But with coccidiosis, the situation is different. Infection is guaranteed and inevitable, as oocysts are ubiquitous in the environment. And what we need to do with coccidiosis management is ensure that exposure is controlled and kept at a level so as not to impact animals either clinically or subclinically, and to allow that acquired immunity to develop. So just finishing up on coccidiosis here. Both environmental management and coccidiosis treatment/prevention should both be employed. And the important thing here on this slide is that and symbol. Both of these things are crucial to appropriately managing coccidiosis risk. The final parasite we're going to consider is the trematode parasite Fasciola hepatica, the liver fluke. In the spring, we can see chronic fasciolosis occurring. And this particular problem, although often not causing clinical disease, can be important for production systems, especially for older animals. This is the life cycle of the liver fluke, just to remind people. A couple of things to note here. One is that there is an intermediate host, the mud snail, and as we'll discuss, controlling mud snail populations is an important part of reducing the risk posed by fluke. It's also worth noting the length of time that the parasite takes to go through its life cycle. So 18 to 20 weeks, quite a long time, with a very long pre-patent period as well, 10 to 12 weeks. So fluke tend to only reach their adult life stages in the animals during the winter, late winter and the spring period. And it's the adult fluke that cause chronic fasciolosis. This condition leads to reduced growth rates and reduced production parameters, reduced production performance, and it also can lead to liver condemnations at slaughter. Severity of disease usually depends on the number of fluke present in the animal. So let's think about diagnosing fluke. And there's a few factors that we should consider as well. One is the farm history. Has a farm or a premises had a particular problem with fluke in the past? What has the weather been like? If it's been an especially wet autumn period or summer period, then the snail numbers will be higher and the fluke challenge can be bigger. What's the geography and topography of a farm? Low-lying farms on very waterlogged areas can have a greater fluke risk. Fluke forecasts can also be useful. In terms of diagnostic tools, well, there are ELISA tests for both blood and also coproantigens. These are more useful at diagnosing fluke at an earlier age. Fluke worm egg counts will obviously be useful for chronic fasciolosis, but remember, it's only the adult fluke that are going to be producing eggs. And again, post-mortem and abattoir reports can indicate if there's a particular problem on a farm. As for the other parasite problems we've looked at, pasture management and good husbandry practices are also crucial in dealing with the condition. For fluke in particular, reducing snail numbers and exposure to snails where possible is essential. So, in a similar way as before, good pasture records of stock usage and disease, reducing those snail numbers, so minimizing standing water, mud and ground poaching on grazing pasture is really crucial. General hygiene is always important, and always, as we said before, remember not to exceed recommended stocking densities. In terms of treating chronic fasciolosis, for sheep, we are using albendazole in this case. So first of all, obviously, we need to confirm the presence of adult flukes through appropriate testing. And then albendazole is chosen because it is a product licensed to treat adult fluke. And when we're dealing with adult fluke, what we don't want to do is select a product that can manage all life stages of fluke, such as triclobendazole. Again, minimizing the use of product helps to extend the lifespan of that active by reducing the resistance selection pressure. So choose a product which manages the adult life stage of the parasite. And as I say, in this case, it's albendazole. And Chanel has the product Albex, which can be used for this purpose. In cattle, the situation is relatively similar, but often less impactful, possibly. The life cycle for fluke in cattle is very similar, as we can see here. Again, the mud snail is the intermediate host. But fluke in cattle, chronic fasciolosis, is very much a disease of production. We don't see acute fasciolosis in cattle very often unless disease pressure is particularly high. So with chronic disease, we get impacts to, again, growth rates and also things like milk yields. And this reduction in the production parameter is said to cost the UK industry around £40 million a year, and that's for both the impact on growth rates and milk yields. In terms of the dairy industry, bulk milk tank ELISA tests are routinely carried out to check for a problem in a herd. And similarly to previously, the test, treat, retest method applies here in terms of dealing with chronic fasciolosis. Treatment options for chronic fasciolosis in cattle are a little bit wider in terms of the number of actives available. But again, we have to confirm the presence of the adult fluke through appropriate testing before a product is selected. And again, we shouldn't use a product which is licensed to treat those earlier life stages of fluke, such as triclobendazole, because we want to maintain the efficacy of that active. So for cattle, we have the option to use a product containing clorzulon, albendazole, or oxyclosinide. And Chanel has Animex Super, Albex again, and Ruminil for these actives. This brings me to the end of the presentation. So we will wrap things up with a very brief summary. So in this presentation, we have discussed the importance of stock management and parasite control in the spring and how appropriate control measures can lead to that return on investment and healthier animals in general. We've looked at responsible use of antiparasitic products. And then we've gone on to consider the key spring parasitic risks that we see, nematodes in sheep and cattle. We've also considered coccidiosis for both species. And finally, we finished up by looking at fluke and chronic fasciolosis. This is a list of references which were used to develop this presentation for anyone who wants to dive into topics in more detail. I would recommend visiting key websites such as SQPs, COWS, NADIS, etc. For further information. These are fantastic resources. All that's left for me to say is thank you so much for joining me today on this Chanel CPD session. I very much hope that you have found the information useful and informative. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to reach out to your Chanel representative, and I look forward to seeing you on another Chanel CPD session in the near future.